sound began as a hum, a dissonant choir of insects swarming across the channel. Then it grew into a thunder that shook the very foundations of London. It was not the sound of one bomb, but of hundreds, a rolling wave-like cataclysm that promised the end of the world, one street at a time. The night of September 7th, 1940, was not dark. The sky was a furnace, painted in grotesque shades of orange and red. The Luftwaffe had brought hell to London, and hell was proving to be a meticulous, industrial process. Incendiary bombs fell first, little magnesium tears that blossomed into white-hot flowers, igniting the old, dry timber of the city's heart. Then came the high-explosive bombs, the blockbusters, whose sole purpose was to tear open buildings and streets, to create voids of despair for the fire to fill. The air was a toxic soup of burning wood, coal, rubber, and something else. Something uniquely terrible. The smell of burned books, of vanished memories, of history itself turning to ash. Beneath the feet of the firemen and the fleeing citizens, deep in the geologically stable clay under Whitehall, the world was different only in its quality of dread. The cabinet war rooms were a tomb of frantic activity. The air, recycled and stale, tasted of cigar smoke, cold sweat, and the faint metallic tang of fear. Teleprinters rattled like machine guns, spitting out casualty reports that were more like obituaries for entire neighborhoods. Men in uniform and civil service suits moved with a tense, controlled urgency, their faces etched with a fatigue that sleep could no longer cure. At the center of this buried storm, a bullfrog in a pinstripe suit stood as a monument of grim defiance. Winston Churchill, his jaw set, his eyes burning with a cold fire, leaned over a large map of England spread across a table. The map was a living, bleeding thing. Clerks updated it with crimson ink, marking each new fire, each direct hit, each crater of despair. London was becoming a constellation of red wounds. He listened to the reports, his head bowed, absorbing the blows. The East End devastated, docks ablaze. St. Paul's surrounded by fire, standing as an island in a sea of flame. He took a long, slow draw on his cigar, the coal glowing like a tiny controlled inferno in the dim light. An aide, a young man with a face gray from lack of sleep and too much bad news, approached cautiously. "Prime Minister, the report from Coventry. The intelligence is confirmed. The Luftwaffe is massing for a concentrated attack. They're calling it Moonlight Sonata. The target is the factories, the Merlin engines." Churchill's eyes did not leave the map. His finger, stubby and powerful, found Coventry on the map. It was just a dot, a name, but it was the dot that held the heartbeat of the Royal Air Force. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, produced in those very factories, was the power behind the Spitfire and the Hurricane. Without it, the RAF would be grounded. Britain would be blind. The war would be lost. The room waited for the explosion, for the famous Churchillian rage. It did not come. Instead, he was preternaturally calm. He leaned in closer, his shadow falling over the Midlands. The chatter in the room died down. His voice, when it came, was a low subterranean rumble, a sound that seemed to originate from the very earth around them. "The enemy," he murmured, the words curling out with the smoke, "possesses an insatiable appetite for destruction. They feast on our cities. They gorge themselves on our history." He paused, letting the silence stretch, punctuated only by a muffled crump from the world above. He tapped his finger on Coventry. Once, twice, perhaps, he said almost to himself. "It is time we prepared for them a poisoned banquet." The silence in the bunker was absolute. Military aides, intelligence officers, and secretaries stared. The words hung in the smoky air, surreal and incomprehensible. A poisoned banquet? What did that mean? Was it a metaphor? A moment of delirium? They looked at the Prime Minister's face, expecting to see madness. They saw only a terrifying, brilliant clarity. It was the look of a man who had stared into the abyss and decided to paint a new reality over it. That single, cryptic sentence was the spark. It was the genesis of the most secret, bizarre, and brilliant campaign of the war. A campaign not of soldiers, but of artists. Not of destruction, but of creation. It was the birth of the Ghost Factory. The man summoned to the war rooms 2 days later did not look like a savior. Colonel John Turner was a man of average height, with a quiet demeanor that bordered on the forgettable. His uniform was impeccably pressed, but it hung on him like a costume. He was an engineer, a problem solver, a man who spoke in blueprints and load-bearing calculations, not rhetoric. He was led into a small windowless office where Churchill, flanked by General Ismay and Lord Beaverbrook, sat waiting. The Prime Minister dispensed with pleasantries. "Turner," Churchill grunted, gesturing for him to sit. "You hit our airfields. You made fields look like towns, and towns look like fields. A clever bit of trickery." "Thank you, sir. Camouflage is a matter of light and perspective," Turner replied, his voice even. "Perspective," Churchill repeated, rolling the word around in his mouth like a fine wine. "I need you to change the enemy's perspective, Colonel. Permanently." He leaned forward, his immense presence filling the small room. "They are going to destroy Coventry." "I know it. You know it. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Turner remained silent, waiting. "We cannot stop every bomber," Churchill continued. "Our fighters are brave, but the sky is vast. So we must move the target. If we cannot save the city from the bombs, we must save the city by giving the bombs somewhere else to go." He laid out the concept with brutal simplicity. A fake city, a replica of Coventry, built in the open countryside, complete enough to fool a pilot flying at 200 miles per hour in the dead of night. Turner's engineering mind immediately began calculating the impossibilities, the scale, the materials, the logistics. "Sir, the resources required, the manpower, it's unprecedented. To replicate an entire urban area." "Unprecedented," Churchill interrupted, his eyes blazing. "So was the Spanish Armada. So was the Battle of Britain. This war is a factory of the unprecedented, Colonel. I am not asking for your assessment of the difficulties. I am asking if you can build it." Turner looked from Churchill's determined face to the grim nods of Ismay and Beaverbrook. He thought of the maps, the red ink, the fires. He thought of the impossible becoming necessary. He straightened his back. "Yes, sir," he said, the two words committing him to a path of glorious madness. "I can build it." His mandate was absolute. He was given a blank check from the Treasury, access to any material he required, and the power to recruit anyone from any branch of service or civilian life. His project was classified beyond top secret. It was given the innocuous, bizarre codename Starfish. Special Fire. Turner's first act was to retreat to a borrowed office with the complete aerial survey photographs of Coventry. He spent 48 hours in a state of near trance memorizing the city's anatomy. He saw it not as a place where people lived, but as a target. He identified the key visual signatures a German bomb aimer would look for: the distinct serpentine curve of the River Sherborne, the radial pattern of the main railway lines converging on the station, the dense rectangular clusters of the factories in the Foleshill district. His plan was not to build a perfect scale model. That was impossible. His plan was to create a visual impression, a sketch in light, fire, and shadow that would be convincing from 15,000 feet. He began assembling his team, his ghost guild. He did not want military strategists. He wanted magicians. He found Arthur Banks in a disused film studio in Denham, a set designer who had created Victorian London for a Hitchcock film. Banks was a man who understood that reality was a matter of convincing facades. "Your job," Turner told him, "is to build a city that has no backstage." He recruited Professor Alistair Peabody from Oxford, a fussy, brilliant optician who had written a seminal paper on lunar refraction and peripheral vision. "The human eye, especially under stress, sees what it expects to see," Peabody explained, adjusting his spectacles. "We must feed its expectations." And most crucially, he found Sparky Jenkins. Jenkins was discovered running a pyrotechnics unit for the Royal Engineers, but his heart belonged to the carnival. He was a short, wiry man with ink-stained fingers and a grin that appeared whenever the conversation turned to explosions. "You want a fire that looks like a fire but isn't," Sparky had said, his eyes twinkling. "Colonel, that's not destruction. That's art. This was the strange army that would save Britain. An engineer, a set designer, a professor of light, and a pyrotechnic artist. Their weapons would be timber, canvas, glass, and gasoline. Their battlefield would be a quiet English field. And their enemy was the entire might of the German Luftwaffe. The location chosen was a stretch of farmland and woodland near the village of Tutnall, several miles from the real Coventry. It was far enough to be safe from stray bombs, but lay directly under a known flight path for bombers heading from the coast. To Turner's team, arriving in trucks under cover of darkness, it was a blank, muddy canvas. Work began with a surreal intensity. Under Banks's direction, teams of soldiers turned carpenters began erecting the skeleton of a city. They drove miles of wooden posts into the ground, creating the frames for factories that would never produce anything. Over these frames they stretched vast tarpaulins, on which artists, many of them recruited from the Royal College of Art, painted the intricate details of rooftops, windows, and brickwork. From ground level, it looked like a child's crude drawing. But from the air, Turner hoped, the patterns of light and shadow would resolve into the familiar geometry of industry. The Moonlight Department, under Professor Peabody's fastidious direction, was tasked with recreating the city's circulatory system. Roads were the hardest. Asphalt didn't glow. Peabody's solution was absurdly simple and brilliant. They laid down miles of a sticky tar-like substance, and then, using farm fertilizer spreaders, covered it in a mixture of finely crushed glass and coal dust. By day, it was an unremarkable gray path, but by night, when the light of a parachute flare or the moon hit it, it would gleam and reflect, creating the perfect illusion of a wet, moonlit road. The railway lines were even more clever. They used long, narrow strips of polished steel, laid on the ground in parallel lines. Between them, they painted the wooden sleepers onto a dark tarpaulin. From above, it was a perfect, glinting pair of rails. To simulate the river, they used rolls of a new reflective plastic material, anchoring it at the edges and using small, hidden pumps to create a gentle, shimmering movement on its surface. But the heart of the deception, the element that would sell the lie, was Sparky Jenkins's fire garden. Turner knew that for a bomber crew, a successful strike was confirmed by the resulting firestorm. They needed to see the city burn. Sparky designed a system of breathtaking complexity. He buried networks of pipes connected to large hidden tanks of a volatile oil mixture. At strategic points where the map showed a factory, a gasworks, a fuel depot, he installed fire pots. These were metal drums filled with a cocktail of tar, rubber, and phosphorus, capped with a remote-controlled ignition charge. He designed different fire signatures. A hit on a warehouse would be a slow, spreading pool of flame. A hit on a factory would be a tall, furious column of fire, fed by hidden vents. A direct hit on a fuel depot would be a spectacular timed sequence. A primary flash, followed by a secondary, even larger explosion, sending a fireball rolling into the sky. He even devised spark fountains, devices that shot clouds of glowing embers high into the air to simulate the collapse of a burning building. It was a symphony of destruction, and every instrument was controlled from a single, buried command bunker being dug into a nearby hillside. The bunker was their theater box. From here, via a complex board of switches and telephone lines, they would conduct the performance. Weeks turned into a month. The Starfish site grew. To a casual observer on the ground, it was a chaotic, meaningless jumble of wood and wire. But to Turner, studying it through a theodolite setup to mimic a bomber's angle of approach, it was slowly coalescing into a ghost, a phantom Coventry, waiting for its moment to die. The call came on the afternoon of November 14th, 1940. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park, having cracked the German Enigma cipher, intercepted and decoded the orders for Operation Mondscheinsonate, Moonlight Sonata. The target was Coventry. The time was that night. A cold dread settled over the Ghost Guild. This was it. All their theoretical work, their models, their tests, were about to be subjected to the most brutal examination imaginable. As darkness fell, Turner and his team took their positions in the command bunker. The air was cold and damp, smelling of wet concrete and nervous sweat. The control panel, with its rows of switches and labeled lights, Foles Hill Works, Rail Yard, Gas Holder Number 1, looked like something from a science fiction novel. Outside, through the periscope, the decoy city was dark and silent. A sleeping giant. They didn't have to wait long. The first air raid sirens wailed from the direction of the real Coventry, a mournful, rising and falling cry that carried for miles. Soon after, they heard it. The deep, throbbing hum of hundreds of German bombers, a sound that vibrated in the teeth and the bones. Then the distant thuds began, muffled, like a giant beating a carpet on the far side of a hill. Each one was a direct hit on the real city. Turner gripped the edges of the periscope, his knuckles white. He could imagine the chaos, the terror, the death. His creation was designed to save lives, but it felt like a grotesque abstraction in the face of that reality. Pathfinders have dropped their markers over Coventry, a radio operator announced, his voice tight. The main force is beginning its run. This was the critical moment. If they lit the decoy too early, the Germans might realize there were two Coventrys. Too late, and the bombs would all be gone. Turner watched the horizon. He saw the faint, hellish glow of the real city burning. He waited, his breath held, counting the seconds in his head. He could feel the eyes of his entire team on him, Banks pale and silent, Peabody nervously polishing his glasses, Sparky, his fingers hovering over the ignition console. "Stand by," Turner said, his voice remarkably steady. "Wait for the second wave." The drone of the bombers grew louder. Through the periscope, Turner could now see the tiny, fleeting shadows of the aircraft, silhouetted against the orange backdrop of the real fires. "Now," Turner said. The word quiet but absolute. Sparky Jenkins slammed a series of switches. For a moment, nothing. Then the world outside erupted. It was not an explosion of chaos, but a breathtakingly precise unveiling. First, the street lights, powerful hooded electric lamps, snapped on along the glass and coal dust roads, creating the grid of a waking city. Then, the factory lights flickered to life behind the painted windows, but that was just the prelude. Sparky began his masterpiece. A railway goods yard burst into a spreading pool of flame. A moment later, Factory A erupted in a towering column of fire. Then another and another. Secondary explosions, timed perfectly, sent fireballs rolling into the sky. Spark fountains sprayed constellations of embers. From the command bunker, it was a deafening, roaring inferno. The heat was so intense they could feel it through the concrete walls. Turner kept his eye to the periscope, scanning the sky. For what felt like an eternity, nothing changed. The bombers continued to circle and dump their payloads on the distant Rio glow, and then he saw it. A cluster of bombers, having unloaded their first salvos, banked away from the real Coventry. They turned, not for home, but towards his fire. They had taken the bait. "They're coming," he shouted above the roar. "They see it." The bombers approached the decoy. Through the periscope, Turner could see the small, dark shapes of bombs detaching from their bellies, tumbling down towards his beautiful, burning lie. The ground shook as the first bombs hit the empty fields around the decoy. Then more and more. The Germans were adding their own authentic destruction to his staged one. A bomb hit one of Sparky's secondary oil tanks, causing a real explosion that was far larger than anything they had planned. The bunker trembled violently, and dust rained down from the ceiling. "Sir, Section C4 is gone. The primary oil line is ruptured." An operator yelled. "Let it burn," Turner roared back. "It adds to the effect. Keep the sequence going." For 20 minutes, the storm raged. The decoy site was being pummeled, but it was doing its job. It was absorbing bombs meant for human lives. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The drone of the bombers faded, heading back towards the coast. The last bomb fell. The only sound was the crackle and roar of their own controlled fires, now mingled with the very real blazes started by the German bombs. Turner slowly lowered himself from the periscope. His hands were trembling. The bunker was silent now, save for the panting of the men and the static from the radio. They had done it. They had stood in the heart of a man-made hell and orchestrated it. As dawn broke, a pale, sickly light filtered into the bunker. Turner pushed open the heavy steel door and stepped outside. The scene was one of apocalyptic devastation. The fields were cratered and blackened. The skeletal remains of their fake factories smoldered. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burned oil and explosives. It was a wasteland, but it was a wasteland that had saved a city. A runner arrived on a motorcycle, his face grim. He handed Turner a preliminary damage report from the real Coventry. The city had been hit hard, terribly hard. Hundreds were dead. The cathedral was destroyed. The center was in ruins. But the vital factories in the Foles Hill district, while damaged, were still standing. The industrial heart of the city had been spared the full, concentrated force of the attack. The decoy had drawn away a significant portion of the bomber force. Turner folded the report, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, pride in their success and a profound, weary sorrow for the price that had still been paid. He looked out at the scorched earth, at the sacrifice his ghost city had made. It worked, he whispered to the morning mist. A few days later, a sealed envelope, marked for his eyes only, was delivered to his makeshift office. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No heading, no signature. Just a line of familiar, bold handwriting. "You have built ghosts that bleed for the living. Now build me more."